For those who don't know me, I'm Stephen Sparks, the owner of Point Reyes Books, and it's a real pleasure to be here today with Irene Solà. I was just saying beforehand that I read this amazing novel, translated into English by Mara Faye Lethem, beautifully translated into English by Mara is one of the great Catalan translators. Just, there's many ways to judge a translation, but I feel like when you read it and it reads as if it's in English, but with some kind of slight texture to it that feels different, then you know it's a great translation. And maybe we can talk about that as well in a little bit. But I read this in a single night back in November and knew at the moment that I put the book down, I wrote to Graywolf pretty much immediately, saying like, this is the book for our Thinking Like a Mountain subscription club, which is a subscription club that we started last summer, focusing on books that engage with the natural world in kind of unique and playful, inventive ways, that can kind of reset or enlarge our capacity for understanding the world that surrounds us. And this book, I mean, probably more than any of the others that we've even selected, it has done so in such a playful and provocative way that I knew, as I said, I knew immediately that this was the book for us. And so far, we've heard such great things from subscribers and people who just pick up the book in the store because they're drawn to it. And also the reviews have been amazing. I mean, it's been amazing to see. And I want to talk about that as well, because in some ways, the novel feels a little out of step with like Anglo fiction, and so I want to get to that in a bit. But as I said, this is absolutely one of the best things I've read in ages, and just kind of really bowled me over. And so, Irene, thank you again for joining us today from Buenos Aires. For those who are like me, who are just being introduced to Irene today, she is an artist as well as a poet and a novelist, has been awarded several major prizes for her work, including the 2020 European Union Prize for Literature for When I Sing Mountains Dance. She has done a few events. We'll be in Berkeley next weekend for the Bay Area Book Festival. So if you're in the Bay Area and you have any plans on getting to the book festival, please do see Irene. And Ethan, your editor at Graywolf Press, has promised that he's going to bring you by the store next weekend as well to sign some stock for us. So you'll get to see our little windy, rugged corner of the world. I look forward to that.
Me too, absolutely. Yeah.
So I was thinking maybe to start, if you wanted to read the first paragraph for us in the original, I can follow that with reading that in English, if you wouldn't mind. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that. So the first chapter is named El llamp. Vam arribar amb les panxes plenes, doloroses, els ventres negres carregats d'aigua fosca i freda i de llamps i de trons. Veníem del mar i d'altres muntanyes i vés a saber de quins llocs més i vés a saber què havíem vist. Rascàvem la pedra dalt dels cims com sal perquè no hi brotessin ni les males herbes. Triàvem el color de les carenes i dels camps i la brillantor dels rius i dels ulls que miren en l'aire. Quan ens van llambregar, les bèsties salvatgines es van arraulir caus endintre i van arronsar el coll i van aixecar el musell per sentir l'olor de terra molla que s'apropava. Els vam tapar a tots com una manta. Els roures i els boixos i els bedolls i els avets. I tots plegats van fer silenci perquè érem un sostre sever que decidia sobre la tranquil·litat i la felicitat de tenir l'esperit sec.
Thank you. So this is lightning. We arrived with full bellies, painfully full, black bellies, burdened with cold, dark water, lightning bolts, and thunderclaps. We came from the sea and from other mountains, and from unthinkable places, and we'd seen unthinkable things. We scratched at the rock atop the peaks, as if we bore salt to ensure not even weeds would sprout there. We chose the color of the hills and the fields, and the gleams and the rivers, and the glints and upward glancing eyes. When the wild beasts caught sight of us, they cowered deep in their caves and crimped their necks, lifting their snouts to catch the scent of damp earth approaching. We covered them all like a blanket. the oak and the boxwood and the birch and the fir. Shh. And they all went silent because we had a stern roof, and it was up to us to decide who would have the tranquility and joy of a dry soul. You can see what, I mean, beautiful in the original, and you can hear the language that Mara has captured in English. Before we get into some of the particulars of the book, one of the things we'll talk about is voice, and because a lot of this it's a voice kind of driven thing. But one thing I want to ask you, because the novel feels it's kind of organically grown in a way, and I wanted to, this is like a kind of a dreaded process question, but I wanted to know how much you plot or know beforehand before going in, because it feels to me as if this grew, which could have been plotted or it could have just grown. I would be curious to hear from you how it came about.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is a novel that grew. This is a novel that grew very organically. So I knew from the very beginning that I wanted to tell a story, that I wanted to settle this story in a specific place, and I chose the Pyrenees Mountains, and that I wanted to tell it from as many points of view and as many perspectives as possible. But that was the idea at the very beginning. And the first chapter that I wrote, and then after that, I did not write anything else in order. But the first chapter that I wrote was the first one, the one that we have just read at the beginning of. And that is a chapter written from the perspective of clouds, the perspective of a storm approaching these hills in the Pyrenees Mountains. And what happened to me with this chapter is that on the one side, I realized that it could be done. I realized that it worked, that I could approach these mountains from above, as if I was a naughty cloud, just like throwing lightning bolts around. But then the other thing that happened to me was that I really enjoyed writing that chapter. It was it was fun, even, I would say. It was joyful. So somehow that made me kind of give myself the permission to try everything that would cross my mind, to try all the possibilities, all the voices, to kind of really play as much as I could with language and with imagination. So then I started like this, playing around with other voices, with other possibilities. And I would say that I wrote the other voices very organically, and I wrote most of them almost all at the same time, because there is lots of connections between one voice and the other and what they tell you. So yeah, that's how it kind of grew.
Yeah, that playfulness is such a kind of a emblematic of the novel. And and it's interesting to me because the novel, like at its heart, like at the core of this novel is kind of a deep, like a couple of tragic losses and grief. How do you approach that? I mean, part of that is kind of embodying all these other voices, but how do you approach that, playfully, but also, with sort of respect for this loss? As a novelist, like you're not glib about it at all, and that's such a paradoxical success of the book to me, is that you can approach it.
Yeah, when I talk about my writing process, I tend to use a lot the word play or playfulness or even game. But for me, the game is something very serious, is something very, very deep, is something that has a lot to do with learning and with asking questions and with critical thinking and with thinking deeply about the thing. So I studied fine arts, and I think that I learned how to write through methodologies of contemporary art, and there the game as something very serious, as something strongly connected with learning and deep thought is it's very key, I would say. So yeah, I would say that this is how I did it. And for me, for example, this idea of using all these like very different voices. Like some chapter is written from the perspective of a group of clouds, but then there is a chapter written from the perspective of a group of mushrooms. Then there is a chapter written from the perspective of some ghosts, or the perspective of a dog who is watching her like humans, like owners have like sex. So all these perspectives, like they actually allowed me to think about and talk about very deep and even tragical ideas and feelings. But precisely because I could place myself in this, like in all these voices, I could play about with these like deep ideas about like life and death and like violence and war. So yes, that gave me this balance, I would say, because like for example, at the very beginning of the book, just like some lines after what we have read, there is this farmer who is also like a father, a husband, and he is picking up mushrooms, and one of these lightning bolts that the clouds are kind of throwing around hits him in the head, and he dies. And the fact that he dies, I mean, come on, that is a tragedy. That is a tragedy for him, that is a tragedy for his wife. But because I don't tell this book only from the perspective of this one farmer, I actually don't use his voice to tell this story. I could also talk about the fact that just after he died, the roe deer continued eating, the grass continued growing, the clouds continued on their merry ways, and actually nothing really changed or nothing really stopped. And that is scary somehow, that nothing stopped for him, but at the same time, lucky all us that nothing never stops for anyone. So all this perspective allowed me to think and to talk about all these kind of ideas.
Yeah, the enlarging of the scope really actually like enlarges the idea of empathy too, I think, in a way that is very interesting. The talk about play reminds me, there's like a I don't have the exact line, but Cortázar has a great line about, there's nothing more serious than children playing or something, like a game, watching children play a game. And I think about that a lot with our 3-year-old who, everything play as this concept is a very tricky and slippery thing, which
yeah, I absolutely agree with this idea of game is something very fun but very serious and very deep. Yeah.
And the playfulness of the novel, I think, I mentioned at the beginning, I think this idea of play in fiction, in the kind of storytelling that you do, and maybe we can just make a quick digression there, because the novel has been very well received. And I think a lot of the contemporary fiction, the sort of auto-fiction kind of thing, which is like almost the exhaustion of fiction, right? It's like, how do you tell a story? And this book is sort of works on a meta level as well, but there are antecedents, of course. Like it seems like maybe you can tell, are you influenced by oral traditions, by sort of storytelling traditions? Because this feels like it harkens back to sort of an older way, but also folded into perspectives that only us as moderns would have.
Yes, absolutely. I am very interested in like folk tales, in oral storytelling, in legends, in songs. But I am very interested in it from quite a contemporary perspective, as you were saying. So for me, there is like a little bit of DNA inside of like folk tales, a DNA that tell us about how we humans as a group have been looking at the world and explaining the world and imagining the world for many, many, many years. And this has like traveled like from generation to generation, and it still reaches us. And I think it is very interesting because it obviously carries our faults and our values. But I think it tells us about who we are and who, like stones do we carry in our bags? And for me to use this from a like critical and contemporary and feminist point of view, but like include this in my writing is something that I am interested in. Absolutely. I have to say that I really, really like storytelling, like in general. So I very much like telling stories, but I very much like to listen to stories. So I would say that is something very important or key in like my world or my writing experience. I try to always follow like my interests when I am researching or when I am writing. So that is one of my big interests. Yeah, storytelling.
Yeah, storytelling seems so important, and it feels in some ways like if you were to tell the story, the mutability of the story feels like, of course this is like pinned down into language on a page, but it feels, I reread it ahead of today, and of course, every time you reread something, there's something different that jumps out or something strikes you, and it feels almost as if this changes, like this is the kind of story that mutates over time. And the sense of things being embedded, that idea of, folktales carrying a little bit of DNA is beautiful because it also reflects the landscape that is such a vital part of this book that in some ways is the protagonist. And there are stories literally, in some cases, embedded in this landscape. So when the novel came to you, or when you came to the novel, however that kind of magic happened, and you thought about that landscape, to take that kind of global perspective, like from above, from below, from the mountain itself, what was it that drew you? Is this your landscape? And was it a sense of, I feel like often there's a sense of like you're trying to get to the bottom of something, but in this, to me, like in all great work, it feels like you're not trying to get to the bottom of it. You're trying to explore it and leave some mystery there. So how do you deal with that kind of tension?
Yeah, I mean, that is not my landscape. It is not that far away from where I grew up. It's like 1 hour driving away. But I grew up in a it was a rural, but industrial rural space, let's say. So there were lots of fields, but still it was quite flat landscape. And this, like the Pyrenees mountains, this is like very mountainous space. I actually was living in London when I wrote this novel. So I think that's funny. It's funny to point that, because some people might imagine me in a very like bucolic, like mountain writing, and I was not there. I was in London, which I think really helped me to write this book in many senses. And there is like a very like contemporary intention in the book that I am sure like living in London and working in a contemporary art gallery, gallery, Whitechapel Gallery actually, in London, like really like kind of helped the book. But for me, one of the things that I wanted to do from the very beginning when I started thinking in this book was to choose a stretch of land. And I chose the Pyrenees Mountains, but I always say I could have chose any other place in the world, like the exercise that I did. You could do in like a city, or you could do it somewhere else. Because what I was trying to do was I was trying to imagine everything that had happened on that single specific place. So I was imagining like all the events, all the anecdotes, all the like stories that had taken place there, as if they were one on top of each other, as if they were like geological layers. And those events could be like human events, but also non-human events. It could be individual events, but also like group, like collective events. And with this book, I was trying to kind of analyze, to like take a look at any one of these layers. And even like I was even interested, as you were saying, in the magical or mythological or legendary layers. So the magical beings that are supposed to live there are one of the layers that live or that happen to happen there. So I was just playing around, analyzing and trying to see the connections between all of these layers, all of these events, all of these experiences that very different beings had in the same place.
Yeah, and some of them are obvious and visible facts of the landscape, and some, as we said, are hidden. I mean, there are landmines from the Spanish Civil War that are hidden. There are ghosts, but there are also the mushrooms. Like, some things are visible, some things are not, but all of them contribute to an environment in which, for us, people live. Like, we think of the people who live there and sort of their stories. One of the admirable things to me is that while all of the voices in the novel are speaking to these human actions in a way, they're also their own things, and you manage that well. And, we in the interview that we sent with the book for the subscription club, we talked a little about sort of I want to say the worry that some people have about giving a human voice to a non-human object, to me feels misguided, because we've been doing this for most of our human history. We've been kind of pinning human voices and values on to objects, in some ways very detrimental ways. But in the way that you tell the story, it's very respectful. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about like the mindset that it takes, or the values that you take into that process.
Yeah, absolutely. There are like different things I could say here. First of all, there is some kind of when writing any character, what I always try to do is try to like understand that character, try not to judge that character, but actually try to like find a way to understand how that character got there. I always say that what I try to do is I build a swimming pool of knowledge, a swimming pool of ideas, a swimming pool of readings, a swimming pool of like experiences that I myself had or that I heard someone else having. And when I have this swimming pool half full, what I try to do is jump and start swimming, and that means writing. But the more you write, aka swim, the more you need to keep on filling with the swimming pool, because writing always takes you to places you had not imagined you would arrive, or you had not imagined that even existed before you started. So yeah, that's a little bit the process. And also sometimes some journalists ask me like, who are you? Like, of all these 18 voices, which one is your voice? And my answer is always none. Like, I don't think like any of these characters, like I don't, but at the same time, there is something of me, something of my interests, something of myself in every character. Even if we are talking about a cloud, or even if we are talking about a mushroom, I did have to find a little door through which I could enter that other way of looking at the world. And then finally, and at the same time, as you said, this is also quite a meta novel, in the sense that there is a lot of thinking about language, and a lot of thinking about how we all experience the world, understand the world, and therefore are able to explain the world in a different way. But also not forgetting that I am using, this is a novel, so this is a novel meant for humans. But still, for me, it was very interesting to, for example, add and play around with other, like, for example, there is a chapter in which there are drawings, because in the middle of writing this book, I realized, wait, not all communication has to do with language. Obviously, we learn a lot, exactly. We learn a lot through like visuality too. Or for example, there is a chapter written like with poetry. Again, it's like in this, like, while you're submerged in writing this novel and thinking about this idea, I realized that I really wanted to be very playful with language, and like poetry is another way of like structuring language in order to talk about the same things, or in order to try and explain an idea, a feeling, the world. And that is also why there is a chapter in the Catalan version that is written in Spanish instead of in Catalan. Again, it's this idea of every language is a different way of trying explaining the world. So there is in the novel itself a lot of thinking about language and different ways of saying things. And the last thing I'm going to say on this is, for example, there are two chapters that for me are connected, or that were connected while I was writing them. And those chapters are a chapter written from the perspective of a roe deer and another chapter written from the perspective of a dog. And for me, in those chapters, I was very interested in exploring how they would talk about human beings, because a roe deer, of that roe deer who is like wild, had never seen a human being before, but the dog had always lived in like human like companionship, like he had always been with an owner and inside a human house. So for me, it was very interesting to get the roe deer to try to say something for which it didn't actually have like language or words or that something that he had never encountered before in relation to a dog who had grown up in that context.
Yeah. Well, they're very successful chapters too, because I mean, this idea of estrangement in a way of reflecting back on our own humanity through the eyes of something totally alien to us was part of the draw and the kind of allure of the novel for me. And so we're talking about voices now, which of course is the distinctive characteristic of the novel is that it's told in different voices, none of which repeat, correct?
Yeah, none of which repeat.
And so I wonder, and maybe this will tie in a little bit with some of your other artistic practice. It seems like collaboration and is important to you in your artistic practice. And to me, this feels like a collaborative novel. Of course, it was written by you, but it's involves so much else that it feels like all of these voices feel you were like it's the world condensed into a novel. Would you think that's a fair assessment? That in some ways it is collaborative?
I mean, I love it. I think it's great, and I do think that I learn, and I even like, and I take, and I like from all around me, and I think that that is extremely interesting and extremely nourishing to be surrounded and to learn from other like writers and other like artists, etc. And I think there is nothing or almost nothing better than to talk about what you are doing with other creative like people or readers or like people who like have a connection with it, or people who just want to go deep in the conversation. And after these like exchanges, there is a feeling that you sometimes get, which makes you want to go home and write, or you want to go home and just do whatever you do. It doesn't matter, like anyone do their thing. But that feeling of excitement, of like inspiration that you can get from connecting with others people's work and ideas, I think that is very, very beautiful.
Yeah, it's like conversation is the thing that, a friend of mine who has been the book buyer at City Lights Books for years talks about how, books are just an excuse for conversation, like not just, but, like they lead to, they lead to things, which is what we're here doing today. And I want to encourage anybody who's watching, if you have any questions, please do plug them in. I think I have enough to keep going for hours, but I'll be mindful of your time. And so your other artistic practice, you're a poet, you've done a few things. It seems like you're interested in Iceland, which I'm reading Independent People right now, Laxness novel, which is your epigraph.
And great novel.
Great novel. It seems like it's kind of floating around the ether right now. I've seen it mentioned several places, and I thought it's finally time. And I'd forgotten that it was the epigraph to this novel. Is it? This is just an aside because I'm very curious, because I looked at some of your other projects, notes on a novel that I'm not going to write.
Yes.
So I'm going to plug that link into the chat so people can take a look at that. How much? Go ahead. Sorry.
No. You go and then I go.
No, I was just going to repeat, like how much of your other practice has worked its way into this or informed this work? I mean, obviously, maybe this is a question for a critic who's analyzing your work, but for you personally as an artist.
Yeah, for me personally, I would say that I don't really like distinguish or separate like writing from like my art practice, for example. I have this feeling that there are a group of interests that I have, that there is a constant research that I do, and that then I transform all this into projects. And I think that it's most of the time it's the project that asks for its format. So it's in the process of working on ideas, on like thoughts, feelings, things that you want to transform into a creative thing. It is in the middle of this process that you realize, or that the project itself asks, if you listen, which format it needs to be in, or like how it has to be transformed into the final thing. So that is how it has always worked for me. And I have this, like, for me, the novels are like art projects that take the shape of a novel. And I really am very interested in the novel format, because for me it allows two things that are the two things that probably I enjoy and like the most, which is, on the one side, it allows me to ask questions, it allows me to learn, it allows me to research on anything that might interest me. And as I was saying, it allows me to go to like amazing places I didn't even know that they existed. And then on the other side, the novel allows me to build this world. It allows me to build like a whole space, world, characters, and then to go inside those and live there for a while, live there while you are writing it. So yeah, I really like that novel format.
How do you, I mean, and how do you know, I don't want to say how when you're done, but how do you know when you reached a point of ending it, because I feel like with this, like this could be an infinite project, but
Yeah.
And part of that, I will say, is it's in English it's like just around 200 pages, but it feels so much bigger than that, which is a real testament to what you pulled off.
There is, for me, I would say that there are two ways of like knowing that something is done. One is when you start having ideas for the new project, because I have this, when this happens, when like a new project comes like marching in, or like comes knocking at the door, okay, then it's time for me to close the one that I'm working in and start like giving my time and energy to the new one. So that's a good way of knowing it. And then for me, there is also like it also has to do with kind of listening a little bit to the project that you're working in, and when you have said most of what you wanted to say, then it's time to start kind of thinking about letting it go, because I have always this feeling like you cannot write all the novels in one. So so it's good to at some point say, okay, this is done, this thing I wanted to experiment, this game I wanted to play, these things I wanted to try to say, they are here. So I mean, I could continue working on it and I could add and add and add, but for me there is a specific moment in which I realize like, okay, it's time to start.
Time to get out of the swimming pool and dry off, right?
Exactly, yeah. And then go and swim in another pool.
Yeah, find another.
Exactly, find another one. Yeah. But this one is like, I've done in here everything that I wanted to do, and everything that like all the possibilities that it gave me. So it's time to go.
Yeah. Well, and to pivot back a little bit, I mentioned that this was our spring pick for our book club, our subscription club. which, focuses in some way on work that engages with the natural world. And I don't think this is an explicitly environmental work. I think the thing that I found so kind of refreshing about it is that it engaged in a landscape on sort of like everything was of the same value, which we talked a little bit earlier. All the voices have the same pitch and volume. They all and so is that fair to say? Were you thinking along sort of ecological terms, or were you thinking in terms of these are characters that make up the world and we are a part of that world? Like, is there a distinction to be made? Is it fair to make the distinction, or yeah?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, for me, that like I wasn't thinking this novel in very clear, like, or I wasn't thinking this novel as a flag, let's say, or I wasn't thinking about it like as having to check certain points. It came from a very honest place of trying to look at the world from very different spaces, perspectives, and points of view, and that was the key idea. And try to deepen in these thoughts of like how we humans tend to look at the world from a very anthropocentric point of view, and we don't realize most of the time, but we do very often think that we are the center, the reason, the meaning of everything that is around us. And we even think that that I don't know, we have like this span of time that we have to live, and we kind of think that that is, I mean, obviously that is everything that we have. Like we have 80 years, 90 years, 70 years to say everything we have to say, to feel everything we have to feel, and to do everything we have to do. And then for me, it was very interesting to think that the same thing, but for a mountain, and realize, okay, wow, for a mountain, 80 years, that is a minute, that is, or less, that is a second. So to be thinking about all these ideas was like the key thing for me. Yeah.
And those frames, those kind of temporal frames that really shift focus and and as I said, they don't lessen the sort of loss and the emotional kernel of the novel.
Yeah,
which is
exactly. Like, and there is very strong human tragedies in the novel that, as you were saying, are taken like very seriously. But one thing doesn't like erase the other. For me, it was very interesting to be able to talk about all these at the same time, and to and to mix them up. But yeah, obviously that like there is, for example, the chapter written from the perspective of Eva Palomita, which is a like kid. It's a young girl who died in the Civil War, and she's telling us about her life in these mountains now that she's a ghost, and like her experience during the Civil War. And that chapter was for me extremely interesting to write. And I would say even like it was a fun challenge for me to write that chapter, but it was a chapter that I wrote with a knot in my stomach and with goosebumps all the time, because what I was talking about, all the like war and all the death that she is telling us about from this like very quite naive, innocent child voice, it was something that it was a strong feeling for me to be writing that. So all this is part of the book.
Rereading that chapter in November, and now reading it while there's a war in Ukraine happening, I had the same deepened feelings about it, actually revisiting it. Were there chapters that were harder or easier for you to write? Like, was there a chapter that was just like, oh my God, how am I going to get through this? And maybe not,
For me, this book was a very strange book to write, because it was a book that almost invaded my mind. It was a book that came like it did, like its characters, its scenes were not knocking at the door in order to come in. They were just like stamping in. And so it's a book that the truth is, it was not a difficult book to write. I did not struggle while writing this book. I mean, obviously you have times in which you doubt, in which you worry, but it was like the general feeling of this book was not one of struggle. And I wouldn't be able to point one chapter and say this was difficult. No, there were chapters that were, as I said, like not in your stomach and like a goosebump feeling like through all the writing process, and some others that were maybe lighter in that sense, but not talk about struggling. However, I do remember, for example, the time in which I had the idea of writing one of the chapters from the perspective of a group of mushrooms. And I remember myself being alone, like on my computer, and like started laughing. And I was like, Irena, are you seriously gonna do that? And I mean, and then I did, and it stayed. I was like, yeah, this is staying.
Yeah, you
But
can't
I
cut
remember,
that afterwards, and yeah.
yeah, I remember it like having it as a almost joke thought with myself. Yeah.
It really works, that chapter. That's the chapter that I often use. Like if I'm in the bookstore and someone's like, oh, what's this? And I'll recommend it. And I was like, just read this chapter. Like stand here and read this chapter, and it hooks people. I've asked anybody if there's any questions. Well, we can carry on a little longer here, but I do wonder. I talked a little earlier about collaboration, and one of the projects that I saw that you worked on with a couple other artists and the singer called Lichen, which was a multi-voiced piece based on a Donna Haraway book. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it was in the CCCB, which is a like museum in Barcelona, and they invited Maria Arnal, who is a great musician, and then Maria Sanchez, who you talked about, who is like another poet and writer. And that was a very interesting process because for like weeks we were just writing like a text together, the three of us, and trying to be very intrusive, let's say, in what everyone was writing. So trying to like, we gave each of us one color, so we always knew who had written something. But like the idea of what we tried was to like really mixed like the writing process, and really like each we working on like the whole text, and then we read it aloud, and Maria was singing some of the parts of it in an event. Yeah, after like, yeah, Donna Haraway also had like an interview, and like it was a very big event, and there was a lot of people involved in that. But it was a very, very interesting and nice project. Yeah.
Yeah, and it feels like it actually reflects the thing that it is thinking about and engaged with, which is very interesting to me. And which, when I discovered that after reading this, I was like, oh, of course, like this, these things make sense together. And so you wrote this, you published this, was it 2019? It was a few years ago. And
yeah, 2019.
Yeah. So how does it feel to be discussing this again, or in this new context? You're kind of revisiting this, and
It's
yeah.
This has been a crazy novel in the good sense, I would say, because it's a novel that has brought lots of things with her. So I have this feeling that I had never actually stopped talking about it, because it really didn't ever like stop. Now what's happening, which is very nice, is like lots of the translations are coming out. So for me, I'm getting to talk about it in English, which is fun because I've been talking about it so much in Catalan and even like Spanish, and to change the language in which I try to explain all these things. I mean, it has to do with what I was trying to do in the book too. This idea of different languages, different sounds, different words, different like grammatical structures, in order to try and say or explain the same world, the same things. So that is being very interesting for me. And also the idea of traveling around and like being able to talk with different readers from all over the world and see like how they received the book, and like that is very exciting. That is very, very, very interesting also. And to see like the different things people might ask, or the different things that might have gotten people's attention. So yeah, it's good. I mean, I am working on another novel, and it's not that easy when you are traveling like very often, but still, like anytime I'm at home, I try to really like lock myself out and just be like focusing on the new work. And then when I'm traveling around, I just try to really enjoy the experience of
being out. I sort of wondered, you talked about, I think that's common to a lot of writers when they're doing their book tour, whether virtual, Zoom, or in person, that you're hearkening back to this thing, but you're also that new ideas are storming into your head, and you're deep in that project. Well, we're coming up on an hour, and I wouldn't be a bookseller if I didn't ask, what either influences, if you can elaborate on those, or what are some contemporary writers? We've mentioned a few already, but what are who are some writers who are doing interesting things, or artists or musicians or whatever, that one of the things that I love about these conversations, that it always, beyond the book itself, it leads me into other directions as well.
Absolutely.
Do you have any recommendations for us?
Yes.
Okay, I got my pen ready. I'm going to take some.
The list of my influences and the list of like books that I read and reread for this novel is very long. But let's just talk about like some of them. I think I should start with like writers such as Mercè Rodoreda. She's a Catalan writer. She's like one of my favorite writers ever. She has a novel, for example, in English called Death in Spring.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a marvelous book that everyone should know about. Then there is another Catalan writer that I very, very much like, called Víctor Català. I'm pretty sure she's been translated into English too, but I'm not that sure. I haven't seen her book around recently in English. And then like many other writers, like for example, as I was saying, I'm a very big fan of Mariana Enriquez. I very much like Fernanda Melchor, who is like a Mexican writer. And I could continue with like Ali Smith, for example. I really like her work. And then Toni Morrison is a big influence of mine, but also Faulkner or Woolf. I should talk about them, or even like Hallar Laxness too. And I could continue and continue. I recently read, for example, something that I very much enjoyed, which is Pyrenees by Susan Clark.
Susan Clark,
I absolutely love that book. And anyways, like, I could make a very long list, but I think that's All right.
Well, that Susan Clark book was one of the, like, I mean, it's popular because, she wrote this Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which was like a big deal 15 years ago, maybe. And then it's a strange novel to be, I mean, it's like set, it's a very strange, like I can't even describe what happened.
I know, it's like, when I talk about this book with people and I said, I just read this novel and I really enjoyed it. And people ask me, what is this about? And I'm like, like a friend of mine recently was like, what is it about? And I think I told him, I think it's better I tell you nothing. Just I didn't know much when I read it, and I just go in and see what you find. And you might not like it, but I think it has a very special sensibility. And I thought it was a very free and bold novel.
I agree.
So that freedom I really like.
Yeah, and Ferdinand Melchor has her new novel in translation is coming out very soon here, Paradise, within the next couple of weeks. And well, I look forward to saying hello in person when you come sign books for us next weekend, or this Friday, I think, whenever you're in the Bay Area. And I will encourage everyone who's on the event today, if you're able to get to Berkeley on Saturday and Sunday, you'll be speaking there on a couple of panels as well. And I want to thank you again for taking the time, out of a busy schedule at another book festival to join us here today.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure, absolutely. And I'm looking forward to be there at Point Reyes.
Yeah, we look forward to it as well. And thank you again. And thank you for this amazing novel. I can't wait to see what's next. And also, I will encourage everyone, I put some links in the chat to dive into some of your other projects on your website. I want to talk about Iceland when I see you.
Yes, yeah. I can talk about Iceland for hours.
Yeah.
So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Have a great rest of the festival there, the book fair there, and safe travels. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.